The lights of Hollywood once belonged to her. Pamela Anderson, the blonde goddess whose beauty was carved into the fantasies of millions, stood as the ultimate dream of the 1990s. She was everywhere, on glossy magazine covers, running in slow motion across the beach in that iconic red swimsuit, and dazzling the world with a smile that seemed untouchable. But beauty, as the world would one day learn, can be both a gift and a curse. At 58, her voice finally trembles as she looks back. Behind the perfect hair, behind the endless photographs, behind the icon the world adored, she reveals the secret she carried for decades. The man who gave her the wildest love of her life, the kind of passion that every woman imagines once in a lifetime, also gave her the deepest scars she would never forget. She was the most desired woman on earth. He was the bad boy every woman secretly wanted. Together, Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee were fire and gasoline. But in the end, passion burned into pain. It sounds like the script of a movie, Hollywood's golden sex symbol falling headfirst into the arms of a rock and roll outlaw, but this was no fiction. Pamela and Tommy were real, and their love story was so explosive that even Hollywood, a city built on drama and scandal, could barely contain it. They weren't just a couple, they were a storm. One was the reigning goddess of television, the ultimate Baywatch beauty. The other was the tattooed drummer of Motley Crue, a man who lived by no rules but his own. Together, they created one of the most intoxicating and destructive love stories ever told. Theirs was not a love of gentle whispers and long walks in the park. It was sweat, tequila, leather jackets, and stolen glances that turned into stolen nights. It was fast, reckless, and hotter than fire itself. When they met, the universe seemed to stop just for them. It was obsession at first sight. It was the kind of electricity you feel once in a lifetime, the kind that consumes you before you even realize you're lost inside it. Within 4 days, just 4 days of laughter, lust, and sleepless nights, they were married on a beach in Cancun. She wore a white bikini, he wore board shorts, and in that moment, the world gasped. But every fairy tale has a shadow, and every flame, no matter how bright, leaves smoke behind. For Pamela, that smoke would choke her for years. What began as an intoxicating high would collapse into sleepless nights, stolen tapes, courtroom battles, and the kind of heartbreak that leaves invisible bruises no camera could ever capture. Tommy Lee wasn't just her husband. He was her addiction, her obsession, her dream, and her nightmare. And so, at 58, Pamela finally confesses it all. Not the polished story the tabloids wanted, not the headlines that mocked her, not the rumors that twisted her truth, but her own words, her own voice. She admits that the man who made her feel like the only woman in the world was also the one who left her broken. She admits that love, when mixed with fame, lust, and danger, can turn into poison. And as she speaks now, softer, older, but still carrying the fire of the woman the world once knew, her story is no longer a secret. It is a warning. This is not just the tale of Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee. This is the tale of passion and destruction, of beauty and violence, of two souls who couldn't live without each other and couldn't survive together. And now, the untold secret is finally told. Pamela Denise Anderson was not born into the world of flashing cameras and million-dollar contracts. She came from a small town in British Columbia, a quiet girl with modest dreams, the kind of place where nobody could imagine that one of their own would one day be plastered across billboards and magazine covers around the globe. She was just another girl with wide eyes and restless ambitions, until fate called her name. It happened in a way that could only belong to Pamela. During a football game in 1989, her face suddenly appeared on the stadium screen. The crowd roared. Her beauty, even caught candidly, was undeniable. That single moment would change her life forever. Soon after, Playboy came calling. And with that, the small-town girl became the world's golden muse. Pamela's body became her power, her smile her weapon, and her eyes her mystery. In an era when desire sold everything, Pamela was the currency. She posed for Playboy more than a dozen times, each cover more iconic than the last, until she became the magazine's ultimate star. For men, she was the fantasy they couldn't touch. For women, she was both admired and envied, a reminder of how beauty could open every door, even the ones that led to darker rooms. But it wasn't just Playboy that turned Pamela into a legend. The world truly stopped breathing when she appeared on Baywatch. There she was, running across the California sands in that unforgettable red swimsuit, blonde hair glistening in the sun, her body moving like a slow-motion dream. Overnight, she stopped being Pamela Anderson. She became fantasy itself. Baywatch wasn't just a TV show. It was the stage where Pamela became immortal. And as the cameras captured her, the world fell hopelessly in love. But the truth is, goddesses aren't built out of marble. Behind the perfectly sculpted image, Pamela was still human. Fame brought her fortune, but it also brought her loneliness. Surrounded by flashing cameras, always adored but never truly known, she began to crave something far more dangerous than money or fame. She wanted love, real love. The kind that wasn't staged, that wasn't airbrushed, that wasn't sold on the cover of a magazine. And that hunger is what would lead her straight into the arms of the one man who seemed to match her fire. Tommy Lee wasn't a dream painted on a poster. He was chaos in the flesh. And Pamela, the goddess in red, was about to find out what happens when you invite chaos into your world. For now, she was still the untouchable icon, the poster on 1,000 walls, the woman men fantasized about and women couldn't stop talking about. But her story wasn't just about beauty or power. It was about the dangerous truth that even the most desired woman on earth could feel incomplete, could feel unseen, could ache for something more. And when that ache finally collided with Tommy Lee's hunger, it would spark a love so intoxicating, so consuming, and so destructive that Hollywood itself couldn't look away. Because no matter how adored a goddess may be, even goddesses crave love. If Pamela Anderson was the goddess carved in red, then Tommy Lee was the storm that could shatter temples. Tall, lean, tattooed from chest to wrist, he wasn't the kind of man who asked for attention, he stole it. Tommy wasn't polished, he wasn't rehearsed. He was raw energy, the embodiment of rock and roll, and for years he had lived on the edge of every limit a man could test. As the drummer of Motley Crue, one of the most notorious heavy metal bands of the 1980s, Tommy Lee became more than a musician, he was the heartbeat of chaos itself. His drums didn't just keep rhythm, they shook entire arenas. Fans didn't just hear his sound, they felt it in their bones, the kind of pounding that made you believe the world might crack open beneath your feet. But music was only part of Tommy's story. Offstage, he lived like the rules had never been written for him. Alcohol flowed like water, parties blurred into days-long benders, and women lined up at every hotel door. His charm was magnetic, but it was his danger that drew people closer. He wasn't safe, and that was exactly why so many couldn't resist him. Every tattoo on his body told a story of nights too wild to remember, and every scar whispered about mornings that came too soon. Tommy Lee was the ultimate bad boy, the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about, the kind of man you swore you'd never fall for, until you did. He had already carved a reputation for being unpredictable, the drummer who partied harder than anyone else in the room, who loved harder, fought harder, and lived faster than the world could keep up with. In many ways, he was Pamela's perfect opposite. Where she was polished beauty, he was untamed madness. Where she smiled for cameras, he snarled at them. She was the poster child of fantasy, soft curves, and sunlit hair, while he was the dark dream of rebellion, tattoos, leather, and danger in his eyes. And yet, it was exactly this contrast that made him irresistible. Together, they would embody every cliché of desire, the goddess who craved the outlaw, the beauty who surrendered to the beast. But Tommy was not just a rebel without consequence. His life was already littered with chaos. He had been married twice before, first to Elaine Starchuk, then to actress Heather Locklear, America's sweetheart. Those marriages, like everything in Tommy's world, burned too hot and too fast. And yet, he never slowed down. If anything, the failures only fueled his hunger for more passion, more risk, more fire. For the women who loved him, Tommy was both a dream and a nightmare. He could be tender one moment, pulling you into the warmth of his laughter, and destructive the next, spiraling into anger, jealousy, and the wild darkness that came with fame and excess. Loving Tommy Lee wasn't just a romance, it was stepping onto a roller coaster without brakes. And Pamela, the goddess adored by millions, was about to step into his world without hesitation. Because what happens when an untouchable goddess meets a rock star with no rules? The answer was as obvious as it was dangerous. Sparks. The kind that light up the night sky, and the kind that burn everything down when the fire runs out of control. For Pamela, the man she would soon meet wasn't just another bad boy. He was temptation made flesh. And for Tommy, the golden goddess of Baywatch wasn't just another woman. She was the forbidden fantasy he was determined to claim. What neither of them knew then was that their union would become more than a love story. It would become the most infamous romance Hollywood had ever seen. One built on passion, chaos, and the kind of danger that doesn't just break hearts, it leaves scars. When Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee finally crossed paths, it wasn't a meeting, it was ignition. She was the blonde goddess of television, adored by millions, and he was the tattooed drummer who treated life like a party that would never end. The moment their eyes met, the room seemed to tilt. There was no hesitation, no slow courtship, no cautious steps. It was electricity that struck without warning, and once it hit, there was no chance of turning back. Pamela later admitted it wasn't love at first sight. Love is patient, careful, something that grows like a flame. This wasn't that. This was obsession. Lust dressed as love. Tommy Lee wasn't just another man in her orbit, he was gravity itself, pulling her into his chaos with a force too strong to resist. For Tommy, Pamela wasn't just beautiful. She was a fantasy he wanted to possess, and once he saw her, nothing in the world could have stopped him. Their first days together were a blur of laughter, sweat, and tequila-fueled nights that melted into mornings. Friends watched in disbelief as Pamela, always the polished star, threw herself into his madness without a second thought. It was reckless, intoxicating, and doomed from the start, and yet, it was everything they both wanted. Just 4 days after meeting, they were no longer just lovers. They were husband and wife. On a sunlit beach in Cancun, Pamela walked barefoot through the sand, her body sunburnt from days under the Mexican heat, her only wedding dress a white bikini. Tommy stood waiting in board shorts, tattoos gleaming under the sun, grinning like a man who had won the world's greatest prize. There were no flowers, no family, no slow love songs. Only tequila, laughter, and the kind of madness that made two people believe they could defy reality itself. When they said their vows, it wasn't about forever. It was about now. About desire too hot to cool, about passion too fierce to pause. In that moment, Pamela became Mrs. Tommy Lee, and Hollywood gasped. News of the sudden marriage hit like a lightning bolt. Tabloids exploded with headlines. Fans couldn't believe that Pamela, America's golden goddess, had tied herself so quickly to Tommy Lee, the rock star with a reputation darker than the eyeliner he wore on stage. To some, it was romantic, proof that love could strike like lightning. To others, it was scandalous, another Hollywood disaster waiting to happen. But to Pamela and Tommy, the world's judgment didn't matter. They weren't living for anyone else. They weren't living carefully at all. They were living at full speed, burning brighter than anyone dared to, blind to the destruction that already waited ahead. The honeymoon wasn't roses and champagne. It was wild nights, tequila poured straight from the bottle, and bodies tangled in salt-stained sheets with the sound of ocean waves crashing outside. For them, love was chaos, and chaos was love. And in their minds, the two could never be separated. But even as they laughed, even as they touched, even as they believed they had found something the rest of the world would never understand, the cracks were already there. Because obsession doesn't last forever. Desire doesn't solve everything. And what they were building together wasn't the careful foundation of a marriage, it was fire stacked on gasoline. Pamela herself would later confess that it all moved too fast. That she had been swept away by something she mistook for love but was really something much more dangerous. Tommy was addictive, intoxicating, and impossible to resist. But addictions, no matter how sweet, always come with a cost. It wasn't love at first sight, the story goes. It was obsession. Lust dressed as love. And it was already too late to turn back. Hollywood watched, waiting for the first cracks to show. But for Pamela and Tommy, in those early days, there were no cracks, only passion. They weren't two people in love. They were a wildfire, and the world hadn't yet realized how quickly that fire would spread. In the beginning, it was everything they wanted it to be. Fire and fantasy. Pamela and Tommy's early marriage was a spectacle of sex, parties, and a passion that never seemed to cool. To the world, they were untouchable, beautiful, young, reckless, and and so deeply entangled in each other that no one could imagine them apart. Hollywood couldn't look away. They were photographed everywhere, at clubs, on yachts, in limousines, stumbling out of wild nights and diving into wilder mornings. Pamela, once the golden goddess of Baywatch, no longer looked like just a fantasy on a screen. She looked like a woman completely consumed by love. Tommy, the tattooed bad boy, couldn't stop bragging about his goddess wife. In interviews, he spoke about her as if she were the crown jewel of his life, the one prize he had claimed that no other man ever could. And for a time, Pamela glowed. She glowed with love, with youth, and with the kind of desire that seems endless when you're drunk on someone's presence. Soon, she glowed with something even greater: pregnancy. The couple welcomed their first son, Brandon, in 1996. A year later, their second son, Dylan, was born. To the world, it seemed like the perfect picture: the rockstar and the goddess, now parents to two beautiful boys, building a family amid the flashing cameras. But even their family life was a circus. Paparazzi followed them relentlessly, capturing every smile, every stumble, every heated moment between them. Their Malibu home became a fortress, cameras waiting at the gates, lenses pointed at their windows. For a couple that had built themselves on passion, the intensity of constant attention only fueled the drama. They were stars, but stars can't shine without also casting shadows. Tommy doted on Pamela, obsessed with her beauty, her body, her devotion. He wasn't shy about the details, speaking openly about their sex life in ways that left interviewers shocked and tabloids drooling. Pamela, for her part, seemed to bask in the whirlwind, her every move amplified by the fame, her every choice scrutinized by the press. They weren't just a couple. They were a brand of lust and chaos, a Hollywood fever dream that no one could turn away from. But love built on extremes has a way of turning dangerous. The same passion that fueled their marriage also lit the fuse of jealousy, anger, and volatility. Tommy was possessive, protective to the point of rage. Pamela, still seeking love and stability, found herself walking the edge of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Friends whispered that the cracks were already showing, that behind closed doors the fire wasn't just warm, it burned. And while the world was distracted by their beauty and fame, the couple's private life was unraveling. Nights blurred into fights, and the chaos that had once felt thrilling now began to take its toll. Pamela was a mother, a wife, and still an icon expected to deliver perfection every time the camera turned her way. Tommy was still Tommy, wild, reckless, and unwilling to change. The very qualities that had drawn them together now threatened to tear them apart. Their sons, Brandon and Dylan, were too young to understand what was happening, but they were born into it nonetheless, a world where love and war coexisted under the same roof, where flashing cameras caught every glimpse of happiness and every shadow of despair. Pamela loved her boys fiercely, trying to shield them from the chaos, but the circus that surrounded their family never slept. From the outside, it still looked like a dream. The goddess and the rockstar, the fantasy couple who had everything: beauty, fame, money, and passion. But behind the smiles and the photographs, storm clouds gathered. Because when love is fire and fantasy, it is only a matter of time before the flames consume everything. Pamela would later admit that those early years felt like living inside a dream so vivid that it blinded her to the warning signs. But dreams always end. And for Pamela and Tommy, waking up would be brutal. It began as something private. Something raw, intimate, playful. The kind of love that only exists when two people are alone, stripped of everything but their passion for each other. Pamela and Tommy had filmed themselves on their honeymoon, laughing, kissing, making love on boats, on beaches, in the privacy of their own paradise. It wasn't a production. It wasn't for anyone else's eyes. It was theirs, stolen moments frozen on tape, a record of the kind of fire that made their marriage what it was. But in 1995, that private paradise was shattered. One man, a disgruntled electrician named Rand Gauthier, broke into their Malibu home. He wasn't looking for jewelry or cash. He found something far more destructive. Hidden in a safe, along with Tommy's guns and personal keepsakes, was the tape. The one secret they never intended for anyone else to see. The recording of their love. Gauthier stole it. And in doing so, he didn't just rob them of property. He robbed them of dignity, of intimacy, of control over their own story. When he released the tape into the world, Pamela and Tommy's marriage was no longer theirs. Their passion had been turned into public humiliation. The reaction was immediate, brutal, and relentless. What should have been private became the most talked-about scandal in the world. Tabloids plastered their names across every cover. Late-night comedians turned their pain into punchlines. Strangers bought bootleg copies of their most intimate moments, laughing, gawking, and judging. Pamela, once the goddess adored for her beauty, was now mocked, ridiculed, reduced to nothing more than a tape she never consented to share. For Tommy, it was rage. He had built his image on chaos, but this was different. This was someone stealing from him, violating his wife, humiliating his family. He fought, he cursed, he tried to take control through lawsuits and anger. But even Tommy's fury couldn't stop the tidal wave. Once desire is stolen, it can't be caged again. For Pamela, it was something much deeper. It wasn't just anger. It was shame. Not because of what she had done, she loved her husband, she had nothing to regret in that. But because the world had twisted it, taken something pure and turned it into a weapon against her. She refused to even watch the tape. She once said, that tape was stolen love. To her, it wasn't scandal. It was violation. The world called it entertainment. She called it rape without touching. No courtroom could ever undo the damage. No lawsuit could erase the humiliation. Pamela was forced to walk through airports, red carpets, even into movie sets with whispers following her, cameras waiting for a reaction, men leering as if they had seen a piece of her soul she never offered. She was one of the most photographed women on earth, yet suddenly she felt invisible, not seen as herself, but as the punchline to a cruel joke. And while Pamela was drowning in shame, Tommy's anger only fueled the chaos. The couple turned on each other, fights exploding behind closed doors, passion mutating into poison. The same tape that once captured their love had now become the knife splitting them apart. Their marriage, once unstoppable, began to fracture under the weight of humiliation the world had forced onto them. Looking back, Pamela would say that the tape stole more than her privacy. It stole her innocence, her sense of control, her belief that love could be protected. For years, the pain of it would hang over her life like a shadow, resurfacing again and again whenever someone dared to bring it up. She had become an icon, but one defined by something she never chose. The stolen tape was more than a scandal. It was a wound. And like all wounds, it bled into everything. Their marriage, their children's lives, and Pamela's sense of who she was. It was supposed to be love, but in the hands of the world, it became a weapon. Every storm eventually breaks. For Pamela and Tommy, the cracks that had begun as whispers in the shadows soon exploded into screams in the night. Their passion had always been volatile, but now it was no longer just fire and fantasy. It was jealousy, rage, and broken glass. The world still saw them as the dazzling couple who had everything: 2 sons, wealth, fame, and beauty. But behind the closed doors of their Malibu home, love had turned toxic. Arguments that began in whispers grew into shouting matches. Tommy's possessiveness, his wild temper, collided with Pamela's exhaustion, her longing for stability, her desperate need to protect her children from the chaos. The love that had once burned like a dream was now burning them alive. And then came the night when everything finally collapsed. It was February 1998, the night Tommy snapped. Pamela was holding their baby in her arms when the fight began. She later described the moment with a pain that still shook her years later. Tommy, furious, lost control. His hand twisted her arm while she tried to cradle their son, desperate to shield him from the violence. The goddess of red, the fantasy of millions, was now just a mother in fear, her child clutched to her chest, her husband's rage unleashed against her. That was the moment Pamela made a choice. She picked up the phone and called the police. When the sirens wailed and the flashing lights lit up the Malibu night, the fairy tale that had once captivated Hollywood shattered into pieces. The paparazzi, always waiting, captured images that would never be forgotten. Tommy Lee, the wild rockstar, being led away in handcuffs. The drummer of Motley Crue, the man who once seemed untouchable, suddenly looked small against the harsh glare of police lights. Pamela, trembling, broken but resolute, gave her statement. She was no longer just the fantasy, no longer the woman who smiled through the pain. That night, she was the survivor. The woman who put her children first, even if it meant tearing apart the marriage she had once believed in with all her heart. Tommy was arrested and charged with spousal abuse. The headlines screamed with scandal. Courtrooms replaced beaches, and mugshots replaced wedding photos. For months, the couple's dirty laundry played out for the entire world to see. The man who had once been Pamela's addiction was now condemned by his own actions. In May 1998, Tommy Lee was sentenced to 6 months in jail. He served time behind bars, his life as a rock star colliding with the cold reality of punishment. For Pamela, it was the end of an era. The moment she knew the dream was dead. She filed for divorce shortly after, putting an official end to the marriage that had once seemed untouchable. The woman who had once been worshipped as a goddess now stood as something even stronger, a mother who chose her children's safety over the chaos of passion. The man who had once embodied rebellion and freedom was reduced to a cautionary tale, his legacy forever stained by the night he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For Hollywood, it was the fall of a myth. The perfect couple, the fantasy of beauty and danger, of goddess and outlaw, had disintegrated in the most brutal way possible. For Pamela, it was a scar she would carry for life. And for Tommy, it was the night the music stopped. The fairy tale was gone. All that remained was silence, shame, and the haunting echo of what could have been. When Pamela filed for divorce in 1998, it wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an era that had once defined tabloid culture. The goddess and the beast, the fantasy and the chaos, the perfect contradiction that had captured the world's attention, were now nothing more than a tragedy. The red bikini and the leather jacket, the beach and the drum set, symbols of their explosive union, became relics of a love that had destroyed itself from within. The press circled like vultures. Every paper, every magazine, every TV show wanted a piece of Pamela and Tommy's downfall. They had once been worshipped as Hollywood's hottest couple, a pairing too wild and too beautiful to ever be real. But now, that fantasy had curdled. Headlines screamed about abuse, betrayal, and scandal. Every bruise Pamela carried became a front-page story. Every court hearing became another chance to watch the dream couple unravel in public. They weren't just two people breaking apart, they were a circus. Pamela was portrayed as the wounded goddess, the tragic beauty whose life was forever tied to men who could never match her grace. Tommy was painted as the dangerous beast, the reckless rocker whose love came with bruises and broken promises. Together, they had once looked like a modern-day fairy tale. Now, they were a warning, proof that fire burns, even when it's wrapped in silk and leather. Pamela tried to shield her children, Brandon and Dylan, from the chaos. She became fiercely protective, determined that they wouldn't grow up swallowed by the glare of the cameras or scarred by the sins of their father. For her, the divorce wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about survival. It was about stepping out of the fire before it consumed her completely. Tommy, meanwhile, struggled with the fallout. His bad boy persona, once celebrated, now looked dangerous and cruel. The world wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were pointing fingers, labeling him as the villain in a story that had once been sold as glamorous rebellion. Jail time had stained his image, and his career, though not destroyed, carried the weight of his actions. For Pamela, the divorce was not freedom at first. It was grief, humiliation, and loneliness. She had once believed that their wild, obsessive love could conquer anything. Now she was left with the realization that sometimes passion isn't enough, sometimes it's poison. The woman who had once been idolized on beaches across the world now had to walk through the wreckage of her own private life with cameras flashing in her face, turning her tears into entertainment. Yet even in pain, Pamela carried herself with the strength that made her more than just an image. She spoke honestly about the betrayal she felt, about the stolen tape, about the violence, about the heartbreak. And by doing so, she reshaped her story. She was no longer just the blonde bombshell in a red swimsuit. She was the woman who survived the beast. The tabloids called them Hollywood's tragic lovers, and in many ways, they were. They embodied a kind of romance that was too intense, too raw, too explosive to last. Their wedding had been a spectacle of impulsive lust. Their marriage, a stage for fantasy and obsession. And their divorce, the grand finale, the fall of icons who had lived too fast, too recklessly, too much in the fire of their own creation. Narration. Every kiss they shared became a headline. Every bruise became a story. Their love had been consumed by its own fire. And in the end, Hollywood's hottest couple had nothing left but ashes. Pamela walked away with scars that the world could not see, scars far deeper than the bruises or the gossip. But she also walked away with her dignity, her children, and a determination to never let love destroy her again. Tommy carried his own scars, but unlike Pamela, his were stains of guilt, his name forever tied to the night the music stopped. What had begun as the sexiest love story in Hollywood had ended as a cautionary tale, a reminder that Beauty and the Beast is only a fairy tale, and that in real life, the beast does not turn into a prince. After the ashes of her marriage to Tommy Lee settled, Pamela Anderson found herself in a strange and painful place. She was free, yes, free from the chaos, free from the violence, free from the unpredictability of the rockstar she had once loved more than life itself. But she was also alone. The world had seen her as a goddess, the woman in the red swimsuit who embodied every man's fantasy. Yet behind the glamour, Pamela's heart ached for something simple, something true, something that could replace the passion she had lost, no matter how toxic it had been. Her search for love became a journey of missteps, of brief romances that flickered like matches but never caught fire. In 2006, she married Kid Rock, another bad boy of the music world. The wedding was impulsive, a glittering display of champagne and sun-soaked vows. For a moment, the world believed Pamela had found her match. But the marriage barely lasted 4 months. The tabloids feasted on the drama, especially after the release of the Borat movie, which Kid Rock reportedly raged over because of Pamela's cameo and her infamous past with Tommy. Their love, if it had ever truly been love, quickly crumbled under the weight of jealousy and old ghosts. Pamela tried again. In 2007, she married Rick Salomon, a professional poker player most famous for his own scandalous tape with Paris Hilton. It seemed almost cruelly ironic. Pamela, forever haunted by the violation of her stolen tape, now tied herself to a man who was infamous for his own. Their marriage was annulled in just 2 months, and though they reconciled years later and remarried in 2014, it too ended in divorce by 2015. With Rick, it was as if Pamela was chasing shadows, echoes of scandal, reflections of chaos, always circling back to a love that never felt whole. And still, she searched. In 2020, she wed her bodyguard, Dan Hayhorst, during the quiet isolation of the pandemic. It should have been different, simple, protective, rooted in stability. But even that marriage unraveled in just a year. Pamela herself admitted that it was a mistake, a rebound wrapped in the loneliness of lockdown. Once again, the goddess stood alone, her heart scarred by the very thing she craved most, love. Each attempt at marriage, each new relationship, seemed to carry the ghost of Tommy Lee. No matter how far she tried to run, his presence lingered. The passion, the chaos, the heartbreak, it was a fire no one else could ever replicate, and perhaps, one no one else should have. Pamela herself confessed it openly. Tommy was the love of my life, but it was the worst pain of my life too. Those words revealed the tragic paradox that defined Pamela's journey. The man who had hurt her most was also the man she loved most. Every new romance, every attempt to start again, only underscored that truth. It wasn't that the others weren't enough, it was that her heart had been branded, scarred, forever carrying the memory of the one love that had burned too bright. Hollywood kept watching. The tabloids never let her escape the shadow of Tommy. Every time she tried to move on, headlines reminded the world, and Pamela herself, of the great love and greater tragedy that had defined her life. Even as she posed for magazines, even as she starred in new projects, even as she reinvented herself again and again, the question always lingered. Was she still the woman who once belonged to Tommy Lee? And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all. Pamela Anderson was more than a fantasy, more than a tabloid headline, more than the red swimsuit and the scandal. She was a mother, an activist, a survivor. Yet for decades, the world seemed determined to measure every chapter of her life against the story of Tommy Lee. And in quiet moments, Pamela herself admitted that even she couldn't fully let go. She stood at 58, still luminous, still strong, but carrying the heavy truth that her greatest love story was also her greatest wound. The goddess had stood in the fire, had been worshipped and betrayed, adored and humiliated. And though she walked forward, she did so alone, her heart forever divided between the love she lost and the freedom she had gained. Pamela's story in those years wasn't just about failed marriages or scandalous headlines. It was about a woman who, despite everything, still believed in love. A woman who kept searching, even when love had betrayed her again and again. A woman who confessed the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the person who owns your heart is also the one who breaks it beyond repair. Tommy Lee never stopped moving. After the divorce, he threw himself back into the chaos that had always defined him. Music, women, the relentless rhythm of a life lived on the edge. He reunited with Motley Crue for tours, dipped into solo projects, and kept the bad boy image alive even as the years began to line his face. The tattoos, the eyeliner, the leather jackets, they were all still there, but something had changed. No matter how fast the drums pounded, no matter how loud the crowd screamed, he could never quite escape the ghost of the woman he once called his wife. Tommy remarried more than once. He chased stability, or at least the appearance of it, but every attempt seemed to pale in comparison to the madness he'd shared with Pamela. In 2019, he married social media influencer Brittany Furlan, decades younger than him. Their relationship was loud, playful, even genuine in its own way, but for the public, and perhaps for Tommy himself, it was impossible not to compare. Pamela was not just another name in his book. She was the book. The love, the lust, the scandal, the downfall, all of it was tied to her. And no matter how many women came after, none carried the same weight. In interviews, Tommy often tried to minimize or laugh off the past. He painted himself as reformed, calmer, maybe even wiser. But whenever Pamela's name surfaced, there was a flicker, a pause, a shadow. Because no matter what he said, the truth was undeniable. She was the one who had marked him forever. Their marriage had been chaos, but it had also been magic. And though it ended in disaster, it was still the relationship that defined him, the one that the world would never let him forget. Meanwhile, their sons, Brandon and Dylan, grew into men. They carried their parents' beauty, their father's swagger, their mother's glow. But they also carried the shadow of their parents' war. They had been born into flashing cameras and tabloid headlines, into a story they never chose to be part of. Brandon would later admit to struggles with anger, even clashing publicly with Tommy in a bitter father-son fight. Dylan, more private, channeled his life into music. Both of them, though, carried the scars of watching their parents' love combust in front of the whole world. Pamela tried to shield them, to give them a softer life, but the shadow of Tommy loomed. Every headline, every paparazzi shot, every whispered story reminded them of who their parents were, not just to each other, but to the world. It was a legacy of passion and pain, of beauty and destruction, one they would spend their lives trying to navigate. Tommy, for all his bravado, often spoke of his sons with pride. He wanted to be the father they deserved, but his past was always there, a weight he couldn't erase. He had given them his name, his fame, his blood, and also his chaos. And in their eyes, he knew he would never fully escape the mistakes of his past with Pamela. For the public, Tommy Lee remained the ultimate rockstar cliché, the drummer with the wild past, the endless women, the scandals, the excess. But behind that image was a man still chasing something he had lost long ago. Because no matter how many stages he played, no matter how many women he touched, no matter how many times he tried to reinvent himself, Pamela's shadow lingered. She was the love he couldn't hold, the goddess he destroyed, the woman who would forever define both his highest highs and his lowest lows. Their love had burned too brightly to ever be forgotten. It was a love that had consumed them both, that had made them legends and tragedies at the same time. And though Tommy kept moving, the shadow of Pamela followed him, a reminder of the life they had shared, the family they had created, and the scars they had left behind. Narration. He had the women, the music, the stage. But no matter how far he ran, Pamela's shadow followed. Because when you've touched a goddess, no other love feels the same. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest wounds, but for Pamela Anderson, the scars of her marriage to Tommy Lee never disappeared. For years, she avoided telling the full story. She let the tabloids speak for her, let the headlines write their own versions of her life. But silence had its cost. It left her misunderstood, trapped in the same red swimsuit, the same scandal, the same endless shadow of Tommy Lee. And then, at 58, Pamela finally chose to take back her story. In her memoir Love, Pamela, and in her Netflix documentary Pamela, A Love Story, she stripped away the fantasy. Gone was the image carefully polished by Hollywood, by Playboy, by Baywatch, by gossip magazines. What remained was raw truth, a woman who had loved recklessly, lost deeply, and survived it all. In her own trembling voice, Pamela laid it bare, the lust that had swept her away in 4 days, the violence that left her bruised inside and out, the stolen tape that turned private intimacy into global humiliation, and the heartbreak that nearly broke her spirit. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a haunting honesty, as if finally unburdening herself of a story too heavy to carry alone. She admitted that her marriage to Tommy nearly destroyed her. The obsession, the chaos, the constant highs and lows had left her gasping for stability, for peace, for safety. And yet, she also admitted the hardest truth of all: it was the great love of her life. The man who hurt her most was also the one who had once made her feel most alive. That contradiction haunted her, but it also shaped her. Her sons, Brandon and Dylan, encouraged her to tell her truth. They wanted the world to see their mother not as a scandal, not as a sex symbol, but as a survivor. Pamela said the process was painful, revisiting memories she had tried so long to bury. But it was also liberating. For the first time, she was in control of her own story. In Love, Pamela, her words were poetic, often dreamlike, but also devastatingly clear. She described her marriage as both intoxicating and destructive. She remembered the joy of their early days, the sun-drenched honeymoon, the births of her children, the laughter and music that once filled their home. But she also remembered the fear, the violence, the humiliation. The contradictions were what made it impossible to forget, and impossible to ever fully heal. In the Netflix documentary, viewers saw a side of Pamela rarely shown. Vulnerable, makeup-free, walking through her old journals, crying as she read the entries of a woman still trying to understand her own life. It wasn't the Pamela the world had fantasized about for decades. It was the Pamela who had lived through hell and survived with her heart intact, if forever scarred. She admitted she still loved Tommy. In some way, she always would. But she also admitted that love wasn't always enough. Love could be dangerous, consuming, even deadly. And surviving that kind of love was its own form of victory. Narration. At 58, Pamela Anderson is no longer just the goddess in red. She is a woman who survived love's most dangerous game and lived to tell the story. Her confession wasn't just about Tommy. It was about herself, reclaiming the parts of her that had been stolen by men, by fame, by the media. By telling her truth, Pamela redefined her story, finally stepping out of the shadow of the goddess in red and into the light of the woman she had always been. She was not just Baywatch star. Not just Playboy's muse. Not just Tommy Lee's ex-wife. She was Pamela Anderson, mother, writer, survivor, truth-teller. And in that confession, she gave herself the one thing she had always deserved: freedom. Love, in its purest form, is supposed to heal. It's supposed to comfort, to anchor us, to give us something safe to return to when the world feels too cruel. But sometimes, love is the very thing that breaks us. Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee were proof of that. Theirs was not a quiet romance. It wasn't built on slow walks, whispered promises, or gentle mornings. It was a lightning storm, electric, uncontrollable, blinding in its beauty and destructive in its power. From the very beginning, it was obsession, lust dressed as love, a passion too wild to be tamed. And for a while, it was intoxicating. Together, they lived the fantasy the world wanted to believe in. The goddess in red and the rockstar outlaw, fire and gasoline, impossible to look away from. But fire, as beautiful as it is, cannot last forever. It burns, it consumes, and it leaves nothing but ash. Pamela's confession at 58 reminded the world of that truth. Behind the headlines, behind the red swimsuit, behind the flashing cameras, there was a woman who had loved too hard and suffered for it. A woman who had been worshipped and betrayed, desired and humiliated, adored and scarred. A woman who finally admitted that the greatest love of her life was also the deepest wound she ever carried. Tommy Lee, too, bore the weight of their story. No matter how many stages he played, no matter how many women he touched, no matter how many times he tried to reinvent himself, Pamela's shadow followed him. She was the love he couldn't hold, the flame that burned him and yet lit his life in ways nothing else ever could. And their children, Brandon and Dylan, grew up with that shadow too, sons born from passion but raised in the echoes of war. Hollywood called them cursed lovers. Some saw them as victims of fame, chewed up and spit out by a world that thrives on scandal. Others saw them as architects of their own destruction, two people too wild, too reckless, too in love with chaos to ever survive it. But perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. Because in the end, Pamela and Tommy's story wasn't about fame, or sex, or scandal. It was about the most dangerous lesson of all, that love, when it burns too hot, can be the sweetest poison. The very thing that makes you feel most alive can also be the thing that destroys you. Their story is Hollywood's ultimate reminder. The same fire that warms you can burn you alive. Pamela at 58 is no longer just the goddess in red. She is a woman who walked through fire, who carries her scars with grace, who found the strength to tell her truth. And Tommy, no matter how far he runs, will always carry the ghost of the woman he once loved and lost in the flames of their own creation. And so, their story lives on, not as a fairy tale, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. A warning. A reminder that love is both the most beautiful and the most dangerous game we will ever play.